From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power with David Weston.
Good noon, everyone. Tom Keenan for David Weston with Anne-Marie Horton in Washington. An interesting week in Washington, an interesting hour of discussion on some of these issues. Yesterday, Anne-Marie, and we can fold it right into a data check here, Dow 35,000. Let's do it again. NASDAQ 115,000. All of this back-to-back on a surging bull market. Doesn't matter what the banks do. Doesn't matter what inflation numbers are. Equities up, up, up. Anne-Marie, how are you doing with your retirement plan?
My retirement plan, Tom, is doing pretty well, especially given the fact that I had a pretty good exchange rate for the past 7.5 years, at least in the beginning.
John Farrow noted that.
Yeah. Tom, but you make a good point. We still have equities higher. This inflation print I'm so focused on because, of course, here in Washington, we're going to hear from the Fed chairman starting tomorrow. What is their response, Tom? Can they just cling to the fact that they think this is transitory?
Well, we'll have to see on transitory. That's in the research right now. Steve Stanley writes an important message wondering if Mr. Powell will remain calm tomorrow in the testimony, of course, two-day testimony there. On the markets right now, I want to consider the equity up number. We're back to where we were early this morning, 15.99 on the VIX as well. And in the bond market, we've had a churn and some real movement off that inflation print with the two-year yield a little bit elevated, and the yield comes back in and lower here on the 10-year curve flattening, and you wonder what that will mean for the banks. Right now, as we look at the balance of power on an infrastructure debate, Michael Zezas joins us with Morgan Stanley, head of U.S. public policy, and much more importantly, with decades of experience in the municipal space. Michael, I want you to give us the Michael Zezas treatment on infrastructure, not so much what it means for Washington, but if we get a first phase with buildings and bridges, what does that mean for municipal bonds, for the cities and the states?
Well, it depends on how much new money is brought to bear and if there's any innovation in that money. Is it a greater incentive for those state and local governments to use the money than they have in the past? What prior research would say is that when the federal government ups the amount of money that's available, you don't necessarily see incremental new spending by state and local governments. However, there's some interesting innovations that are at least part of the bipartisan plan, like the return of Build America bonds. That could be a bit of a game changer for the market. So I think if you're a state or local government here, obviously you're on the credit upswing. Fundamentals have been really strong. It's a prime opportunity to address deferred capital liabilities. You're going to be really interested in what some of the bill text says about whether or not Washington is not just going to bring new money to the table, but accept a greater burden of the financing.
Michael, I spoke to a good guest yesterday from Oklahoma and went to the gas tax, which you know is anathema out there in whatever form the gas tax is. You are expert on this rhetoric. If we have a dedicated gas tax, does America die?
I think that's a bit of hyperbole.
Really? Well, we're good on that at 12 noon.
No, listen, I think the gas tax in some ways, I think is kind of a moot point in the sense that the administration's been pretty clear that they view that as a tax increase on incomes below $400,000. So it's really not in the mix as a pay for. It traditionally has been the pay for. It fills up the transportation trust fund, but it seems like a non-issue this time around.
Yeah, I can never see an American president signing off on a gas tax.
Correct.
Michael, good afternoon. I loved what you said in your podcast. It's either go big or go bipartisan. Can the Democrats get on board with just a bipartisan hard infrastructure deal?
I think probably not. Probably there is not the votes for that, which is why you've seen now this explicit linking by Democratic congressional leadership of a bipartisan plan and a budget reconciliation plan. Either the two of them pass together or they probably don't pass at all, because Speaker Pelosi has said that she won't consider the bipartisan plan without the Senate having passed the budget resolution. So therefore, we think that's going to add up to something in the neighborhood of $4 trillion of spending over the next 10 years. I think there's probably only enough votes for something in the neighborhood of $2 trillion of new revenue. So where this matters, I think, a lot for the bond market, whether a muni investor or treasury investor, is that next year we think the deficit could increase another $250 to $500 billion. We don't think that's in the price. It's one of the reasons our treasury team is advising people to shorten up on duration at the moment.
I look, Michael, at the infrastructure debate, and the overlay here is on common debt. I want you to describe what you would say to Morgan Stanley clients about our debt and our deficit. We've gone through tranche 1, tranche 2, tranche 3 of fiscal stimulus. Obviously, there's something coming down the pike. How do you frame our debt and deficit to Morgan Stanley clients?
So I think a lot of clients ask this question from the perspective of at what debt to GDP level or what absolute level of debt do we have a problem as a bond investor or otherwise? I think that's sort of the wrong way to frame it. Really, we should be paying attention to what I think, frankly, most of the media investors are paying attention to right now, which is inflation. Inflation is the real constraint in terms of have we created too much debt that devalues bonds in some meaningful type of way. At the moment, it would appear to be that that's not necessarily the case. Obviously, there are some decent prints today, but all we've done since the global financial crisis is expand deficits substantially, and we haven't really created the problem that in some cases the Fed, in some cases some of the political parties want, which is more meaningful and sustainable wage inflation.
Michael, tomorrow, when we do hear from Fed Chair Jerome Powell, the Democrats and Republicans are going to try to use the inflation print towards their advantage. Do you expect the Republicans to say this is why we cannot have a massive $6 trillion infrastructure package?
I expect they'll use that talking point. I don't expect it'll be very meaningful, though, to the outcome. At this point, if you look at any issue poll, American voters are not particularly concerned about deficits. They're not concerned about inflation. Those things register in the low single digits in terms of top concerns. Now, and the Democrats in particular might look at some of this inflation as a feature and not a bug. So it's possible over in the full course of time that voters are going to be fed up with inflation. That probably can't happen fast enough to influence this legislative process.
Michael, we got to leave it there. Michael Zezas, thank you so much. With Morgan Stanley, head of U.S. Public Policy, keeping us abreast of infrastructure. You take over the tax desire, Anne-Marie Horton, of Pillar 1, Pillar 2. You really wonder what Pillar 1, Pillar 2 is of infrastructure as well.
Yeah, how are they going to get this through Congress? And is it going to be through budget reconciliation, or will it have to be a treaty? And that's going to be so much harder for this administration to do.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting. I want to go to an important research note this morning, which folds into our balance of power, and that is a debate we see among our guests across all of Bloomberg surveillance and balance of power on our economy, the American economy. Capital Economics out this afternoon, really moments ago, with a really cautious view of the place forward here on GDP, looking at statistics nicely below where Jan Hatzius and Goldman Sachs were easier this morning. That does redound back to the politics of Washington. Please stay with us with red and green on the screen, but a big up on the NASDAQ 100. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television, on Bloomberg Radio. On Bloomberg Radio, on Bloomberg Television, Balance of Power. We welcome all of you. Tom Keenan, Anne-Marie Horton in for David Weston. Interesting day, interesting inflation statistics. Banks, all in all, with pretty good numbers, although they trade off this morning. NASDAQ 100 leads the way, up 0.7%. We print 15,000 on the NASDAQ 100. No doubt Apple leading the way. Always leading the way with our first word news. Here's Mark Crumpton.
Tom, thank you. Researchers supported by the National Institutes of Health say people who receive both doses of a messenger RNA vaccine, such as Moderna or Pfizer, may not need an additional booster shot for years. The team found the shots presented a strong, persistent immune response against COVID-19. However, they say there is a concern about possible new variants that may turn up. As international travel increases, some Americans whose passports expired during the pandemic are finding their trips might be in jeopardy. Renewals are taking much longer than before the pandemic. The State Department tells Dow Jones the turnaround time for a standard passport application can be 18 weeks. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg.
Mark Crumpton, thank you so much. This is going to be fun. We have had such a joy in talking with virologists, microbiologists about this pandemic. We have learned so much, led by the people at Johns Hopkins University, but many others as well, Imperial College in London, and I think of Peter Hotez's great work. Now on the social aspects of this pandemic, and that does fold into our politics in Washington, Professor Matthew Motta joins us with Oklahoma State University, whose cottage industry is worrying about the science of this with a particular focus out of the University of Minnesota and their leading work on the young. Matthew, I've got 1 hour of questions. Amory Horton said I can't do that. So let's just get started right now. I want you to take me from Andrew Jackson, who revolutionized the plantation presidency of Virginia, Andrew Jackson all the way out to the great unvaccinated today. What is the politics of the unvaccinated?
Absolutely. You know, we're seeing a very strong partisan divide in COVID-19 vaccine uptake. This mirrors partisan divides that we've seen in other vaccine uptake across the U.S. in the recent past. And one of the things that I think we really need to focus in on right now is the role that elite rhetoric and elite communication are playing. GOP politicians who are casting doubt, for example, on the Biden administration's intentions, trying to encourage people to go out and vaccinate. You know, at the beginning of the pandemic, folks like me were asking politicians to get out there and endorse the vaccine, to encourage Americans to get it. At this rate, I think we'd be satisfied with having politicians not bemoan the vaccine, to have folks at CPAC this past weekend cheer when it was announced that the Biden administration fell short of reaching its vaccine administration goals by July 4th. If we want to put this pandemic behind us, this is the type of rhetoric we need to leave aside.
There's also the latest worries, Matthew, when you look at the J&J shot about potential things that can happen after you get some of these vaccines, even though the rates are so low. What does this do? What did we learn from the first recall of the J&J in the sense that people are just unwilling to get the vaccine given latest data?
Absolutely, and that's a really great question. And we can learn a lot from the initial pause of the J&J vaccine back in April. So what we saw in the data was relatively mixed evidence that the initial pause had any impact on people's intentions to vaccinate. Overall, intentions to vaccinate remained relatively where they were. We saw a slight dip in the vaccine uptake data, but relatively speaking, most people who wanted to vaccinate continued to do so. But importantly, where we saw some difference was that confidence in the J&J vaccine specifically went down. Now in April, there was a heck of a lot less vaccine choice than there is now. Demand was higher, more people were getting vaccinated, and the vaccines were being rolled out. Now people may have the opportunity to consider other vaccines. This won't be the case for everyone, but they may be able to do so. What this decision could potentially do is move folks toward considering these other vaccines if they're the types of people who plan to vaccinate. But it also, depending on how much media attention it gets and what it is that we ultimately learn about all this, encourage people to not vaccinate at all.
Professor, you're out of Minnesota. I consider the Federal Reserve Bank at Minnesota the font of young study, education of young children across America. And of course, University of Minnesota picks that up as well. How urgent is it to get an under age 12 vaccine on a social basis? What's the urgency to get the little kids vaccinated?
Yeah, so, with the caveat that I'm not someone who studies vaccine science, what I will say from a social perspective is that my colleagues and I have been arguing throughout the pandemic that it's very unlikely that we're going to hit the 70, 80% threshold of adults being vaccinated that we need, or rather of Americans being vaccinated, that we need to put the pandemic spread into decline. And so this means that some of that slack is going to have to be picked up by other demographic groups. And one of the things that we're seeing in the data right now is slightly higher levels of vaccine hesitancy among young people. So having more opportunities to get more people vaccinated is ultimately, I think, how we're going to get to that number, if we get to that number at all.
Matthew, Israel's already doing a booster shot with Pfizer. The jury's still out if we're going to need one in the United States. Dr. Anthony Fauci says he wants to look at the data overall. But if you cannot get people to vaccinate on the first and second shot, how is America going to get people to take up a booster shot?
Yeah, this is going to be something that we're really going to have to finesse with our communications approaches, because you're absolutely right. If the demand isn't there for shots numbers 1 and 2, there isn't necessarily going to be a demand, or certainly as high a demand, for shot number 3. I want to talk a little bit about the role that transparency might play and link this back to the J&J vaccine a little bit. With these concerns about the possibility of GBS being a potential side effect, you have regulators in the federal government making an effort to be transparent, to put this on the warning label with the hopes that that's going to increase vaccine uptake. And that's not necessarily going to be the case. Typically in situations like this, we tend to see demand for vaccines go down a little bit, despite the transparency. Trust in the scientific community might go up, and that's a good thing in the long term. But it doesn't necessarily mean that people are going to want to vaccinate now. What we need, in my view, oh, absolutely, yeah.
Matthew, no, we're just going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much for your time. Matthew Motta, Oklahoma State University assistant professor. A very important conversation, Tom. Tom, when I got my second vaccine here in Washington, D.C., I got $25 to use towards the pharmacy. And I was wondering, did you get any sort of incentive to take up your vaccine?
Yeah, I got my $25. That's pretty cool. You could use that at Ben's Chili Bowl, I guess, as a pharmacy assistant. Olivia Rodrigo will assist the president in youth vaccination. That's a license. Do you know the song, Anne Marie? Olivia Rodrigo, Drivers.
I'm gonna need a lesson in the break.
I've
Fire
heard
up YouTube.
485 times. Whoa, he broke up with me. I drive by his house. The agony. Balance
Make
of
it
power.
stop. This is Bloomberg.
Balance of power. I'm Tom Keenan for David Weston with Anne Marie Ordern as well. It's real simple. Boeing's got problems. They have to bring back the Boeing 747. Here's David Wilson.
Well, the problem that they're facing now is with the 787 Dreamliner, which, by the way, accounted for more than 70% of their deliveries in the first half, even though they were suspended in the middle of May, because of issues with the airframes. Now, we got a person familiar with the matter telling us that, it's all about wrinkling in a component of the plane's nose. And now Boeing expects to deliver less than half of the 787 Dreamliners that are now in inventory, and they had been looking at more than half. So things are getting worse for Boeing.
David Wilson, thank you so much. Stay with us. This is Bloomberg. On television, on radio, Balance of Power with David Weston. I'm Tom Keenan for Mr. Weston. Anne-Marie Horton helping out in Washington as well. Lots going on in Washington. An important conversation on trade in a moment. NASDAQ leads the way up 0.7%. A print of 15,000 on the NASDAQ, much like the symbolism of the 35,000 print on the Dow that we saw yesterday. SPX up 4 points as well. Now with our first word news, here's Mark Crumpton.
Tom, thank you. Senate Democrats have put legalizing marijuana on the legislative agenda. Bloomberg has learned that Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, Finance Chairman Ron Wyden, and Senator Cory Booker of New Jersey will release a draft of their marijuana bill tomorrow. It would remove marijuana from the federal list of controlled substances. That could be a difficult vote for some Democrats from more conservative states. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen expects to get some help in pushing Congress to approve that global tax agreement. Secretary Yellen tells Bloomberg that American businesses are likely to provide crucial support that may be needed to help overcome Republican opposition. The International Energy Agency warned that oil markets will tighten significantly unless the OPEC Plus coalition agrees to increase production. There's a deadlock between Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. Brent crude is now trading at close to a 2-year high. Iraqi medical officials say the death toll from a fire on Monday at a hospital in southern Iraq has risen to more than 90. The blaze ripped through the coronavirus ward of a teaching hospital. Some are blaming local and government officials for what they call years of mismanagement and neglect. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg. Anne-Marie?
Mark Crumpton, thanks so much for that. Now, the UK International Trade Secretary, she downplayed the hopes of getting a trade deal between the United States and the UK before the end of this year. Liz Truss also said she would like to see easier travel from the UK to the US. A lot of people agree with her there. She spoke with me on the sidelines of her meeting with US Trade Representative Katherine Tai in Washington, D.C.
I have never set a deadline for any trade negotiation because the important thing is to get the right deal that works for both countries. And I think there's a huge amount we can do together. The US is the UK's largest single country trading partner. There's 1 million Brits work in the US, 1 million US citizens work in the UK, work for UK businesses. So there are huge opportunities to build a closer relationship. That's why I'm going over to the West Coast to meet leading figures from the tech industry, meet politicians on the West Coast as well. But I'm interested in getting the right deal that suits both of our countries rather than being in a hurry to do it.
And I used to be one of those Americans in the UK working. There's loads of us. If you're looking for more of a comprehensive, the correct deal, is it fair then, though, to say that that cannot be done by 2021, by the end of this year?
Well, that would be a very rapid timeline. We've just concluded a agreement in principle with Australia, and that took a year from start to finish, and that was a very rapid timeline. So I'd agree that the kind of timeline you're talking about would be extremely fast. And what I am interested in is getting a high quality agreement, having those discussions right across the United States about how we can work more closely together. Because we do face threats from elsewhere in the world of non-market economies, of market distorting practices. And this is, I think, a strong basis for not just the UK and the US, but also other like-minded countries to work together.
I also want to move on to this potential for travel corridors. We've heard time and time again that the UK and US are working on some sort of travel corridor coming out of the pandemic. Now, I have left the UK twice when I was a UK resident to come to the United States. And because I had a blue passport, I was able to enter pretty freely. That is not the same for British individuals, even if they are vaccinated. Is there any progress with the US government on this?
Well, this is an area we are keen to see progress on. Of course, I've been talking about the level of investment of UK companies in the US and vice versa. Of course, we need to make it easier for business people to travel, because ultimately that's what helps drive trade. It's what helps drive economic growth. We know there's only a certain amount you can achieve on a Zoom meeting, and we would like to see an easier flow of our business travelers.
That was part of my interview with Liz Truss, UK Trade Secretary. Tom, she is here in Washington, D.C. for a few days, and then she's going out to the West Coast to talk to tech CEOs. The main takeaway is that she says she wants to be a comprehensive right deal, not a quick deal. But that might not be up to her, Tom. We did know the UK wanted a quick deal, but it looks like the Biden administration, they have other agenda items to get through first.
There are balance of power items here. There are items in the United Kingdom, like their entire trade strategy post-Brexit. And there's also, Anne-Marie, the items transatlantic to the election cycle in the United States. Separate from that is this travel issue, as John Farrell brought up with the Secretary of Transportation, and you delicately brought up with her. You just wonder, when does it get fixed?
Yeah, and to Jonathan's point, I left the UK not vaccinated, had to go to New York for some personal reasons, and Jonathan was fully vaccinated. The science doesn't exactly always match what your passport says, but at some point, are they going to come out, which is a little bit more scientific, updated rules, given we do know all the science behind the Delta variant and the vaccination of it?
Yeah, well, I'll tell you what's interesting here, folks, and let me translate what you just heard. Anne-Marie snuck into the country over Niagara Falls, and Pharaoh spent 3 weeks in Capri. That's what we're doing here.
Heathrow to
Futures
JFK.
Up,
there was no sneaking in.
yeah, right. NASDAQ up 0.8%, 115 points. Stay with us. It is a balance of power. Good noon on radio and television. Balance of Power. David Weston holding court. Tom Keenan to assist today with Anne-Marie Horton in Washington. Much going on. It is by all reports a busy week, and it seems to have gotten busier. Not only are we distracted by Cuba and serious protest down there, Afghanistan and the challenges that we see there for an exiting United States, but also many different policy efforts as well. Saleha Moshe joins right now, our Treasury reporter, on Janet Yellen in Brussels. Saleha, let's begin with the obvious. Did the Secretary have a successful trip?
She did. She cemented the G20 agreement across 130 nations that are part of the OECD. She cemented a lot of agreements toward how to get Ireland into the deal, and she made a solid imprint on the message that America is backed and that multilateralism is the best way to combat other problems in the global economy.
She thinks that the corporations are going to stand behind one of these pillars, the 15% global minimum tax. Is she right?
That's what we're hearing. It sounds like businesses have come to terms that this kind of a deal is the best for the global economy, best for businesses in the long run, to end the race to the bottom and end the political uncertainty around tax issues. But, it remains to be seen if there will be enough Republican support for this to make it through Congress.
I look, Saleha, at where we are, and the dreaded T word is their treaties. We were talking with Greg Villiers about the Canadian Fisheries Treaty of 1888 earlier this morning. I know you got that cold for your new book. Treaties, they take forever, don't they?
The JCPOA technically was never a treaty, and they were able to get that through Congress. I think the best thing that we should expect the Treasury lawyers to be working on right now is to figure out how they can make sure that this is not a treaty, but there's no certainty there yet.
Where is the thinking behind whether or not this goes through a budget reconciliation or a treaty? And what does Janet Yellen think about a treaty? Do they think that they can actually get that done?
She hasn't said much on the treaty issue. I think a lot of the lawyers that are behind this, inside Treasury, outside of Treasury, and in Congress, are still trying to figure out what the law says, what the precedent is for this. Right now, the message that she seems to be sending to Congress and to European allies with whom she worked with on this deal is that there is no way that this will not pass Congress because there's enough Democrats to support it and enough business interest that Republicans will have to come on board.
Saleha, thank you so much. Yeoman's duty today. Saleha Mosin, our Treasury reporter. Important comments from Secretary Yellen in Brussels. He will darken the door tomorrow. He will darken the door Thursday. That would be Chairman Powell on Capitol Hill. Julia Coronado is the only one on the planet who knows it used to be Humphrey Hawkins. There's now some fancy name for it now, and we're going to go over what will be said and not said by the chairman. She's with Macropolicy Perspectives and wonderful on estimating our economic growth. Dr. Coronado, I love what Capital Economics said. They said Stephen Stanley at Amherst Pierpont said the worst outcome for Chairman Powell would be to say remain calm. Can he say that?
Well, he will remain calm. I mean, I think his tone is going to be one of optimism that the recovery is proceeding faster than prior recoveries, which was the intent of both fiscal and monetary policy. He's going to expect good numbers on the labor market. We've already gotten a solid June report. And so he's going to sound very bullish. He's going to sound sanguine on the inflationary pressures. He will be asked about them. But I don't think he's going to get a lot of pressure from Congress to sort of rip back monetary policy support and short circuit the recovery
Okay,
either.
but you're telling me in the testimony in the next 2 days, I'm not going to hear about Walter Heller in the 1960s?
You know, I think there are many sort of cyclical comparisons we can make to the past, whether it's post-World War II inflation or the building blocks for the 70s inflation. I think that, you know, he is going to be asked about the price surges we're seeing. There still is every reason to be calm about these price pressures. It's a lot of cars, a lot of car inflation, and, you know, everything else looks reasonable. We are seeing some cyclical turn in rent inflations. They're still low. It's still low level of inflation. That's a good indication that the recovery is starting to build momentum. We're seeing that in the labor market. So I do think he's going to indicate that the planning process for normalizing policy is about to get underway, that it's appropriate. They've seen enough. They're going to start planning it, but it's going to be a methodical planning to give plenty of runway to the markets. I mean, look, Tom, ironically, the more the Fed signals that they're moving towards normalization, the lower long-term bond yields go. So that's a little bit of a mystery and sort of indicates that on the medium-term horizon, there isn't a lot of worry about inflation. There's more worry about medium-term growth prospects.
I mean, Anne-Marie, I'm looking here at the real yield, the 10-year real yield, negative 1.01. Julia Coronado has turned that in her gloom down to an ever more negative statistic.
Yeah, Julia, I'm also just wondering, at some point, does Chairman Powell have to say that this is, though, still more than just base effects, given the rate and velocity of this kind of inflation, or is he just going to put that off to saying, listen, this is bottleneck issues and it's going to start to quell down?
Well, they have been saying it's more than base effects. I mean, it's definitely more than base effects, and they had a whole detailed explanation in the monetary policy report on supply chains and bottlenecks. And that is a big driver of this. The rental car market and the used car market are sort of ground zero for all these forces coming together. The pandemic shutdown and reboot and all the frictions that come with trying to do that, the supply chain issues in the semiconductor industry, and the fiscal impulse that gave consumers lots of cash to spend. All of that, again, the peak of all of that intensity, this is it. We're at the peak. That fiscal impulse is starting to fade. Goods spending is starting to moderate. Supply chains are ramping up. So, there is every reason to expect a lot of resolution to this. This is not some simple macro narrative. We have been through a quite unusual shutdown and reboot of the global economy. And by the way, it's not like all the clouds have cleared. We've got the Delta variant now.
Julia, the Delta variant for most people, not to make a joke about the pandemic, but people are seeing rents to the moon. They're seeing home prices to the moon. Don Rissmiller, wonderful over at Strategas, publishes moments ago on the idea of owner's equivalent rent. How does Chairman Powell answer when a senator or member of the House says, what about my constituents' rent?
So actually, rent isn't going to the moon. Rents in urban areas have decelerated quite a lot in New York, in San Francisco, in LA, and a lot of the urban cores that were the epicenter of rents in the prior cycle saw a lot of disinflation in those rents because people moved to other areas where rents are picking up. So that the aggregate number is a mix of some of the pandemic migrations that we saw. Home prices, that's the whole concept of owner's equivalent rent. Housing is both a consumption good and an investment good. Those capital gains and the price pressures that come with house prices are not intended to go into consumer inflation. We can debate whether that's right or not, but that's been the way it's been for a long time. And certainly when they set the 2% target, that was already well understood. So home prices, Tom, if we're finally seeing the millennials buy homes, the answer is not to kill demand. The answer is to build more homes. So if that's the sectoral issue, that we are seeing this demographic lift to home prices, hey, let's relax some of those zoning restrictions. Let's ramp up those lumber mills and let's build more homes. That's the answer to that problem.
Julie, I also think you make a point that it depends what city you're in. In Washington, D.C., I've been looking for an apartment, and there's just so much supply. Oh, there's so much supply, Tom. They're actually saying, I'll give you 1 or 2 months rent.
Really?
I
had no idea.
That is true. There is a lot of supply. A lot of people left the city and they're now coming back. But Julia, I want to turn to one point on politics. This is his last biannual speaking engagement to Congress before his term expires in February. Anything he needs to avoid or say to potentially shore up that he gets the tap for another term as Fed chair?
Absolutely. So Chair Powell has managed his relationships with Congress extremely well, with both sides of the aisle. In the most recent testimony, we saw the warmest of receptions from both parties. So I think that, for the Biden administration, a Powell renomination is an easy decision. Continuity at a time of policy transition, and somebody that makes both sides happy and has good communication skills, that seems like an easy decision. And so all he has to do is do what he does, which is speak clearly and plainly, be patient in policy, and yet at the same time, not be partisan. He is looking at the medium-term prospects of the economy. The Fed already signaled to us in June, the message was, if inflation doesn't prove transitory, we will act. We will pull forward that normalization and move as needed to keep the economy's medium-term dynamics healthy and strong. And that's kind of what we needed to hear. And so I think it's just sort of stay the course, just be his best self. And I think a renomination is likely.
That's what Tom says every morning. Be my best self before he gets on air. Julia Coronado, Macropolicy Perspectives founder.
Coronado's laughing at that.
Yeah. Thank you for joining us. Coming up on the program, White House National Climate Advisor Gina McCarthy on the Biden administration's whole of government approach to addressing climate change and sustainability. This is Balance of Power from New York and Washington on Bloomberg Television and Radio.
On radio and television, Balance of Power with David Weston, Tom Keene, and Anne-Marie Horton in for Mr. Weston. Today, Anne-Marie, this is about Boston Strong. And no, it's not the Secretary of Labor, Martin Walsh. It's Boston Strong from Dorchester and Canton, just south of Boston. And it's a really, really cool story. This is where you go to UMass Boston, which is not Ivy League, and you get out and you get to work. That's what Gina McCarthy has done for years. Gina McCarthy from UMass Boston, from Tufts as well, and on to being the White House National Climate Advisor for the President. Here she is on clean energy.
One of the things we decided to do not too long ago, really, only a couple of months ago, is to work with Janet Yellen and the National Economic Team here with Brian Deese and others to take a look at how we could start really working ourselves to make sure that where we had some leverage to get businesses to start accounting for their emissions, including the business of the federal government, and start reporting it in a transparent way, that it would give people a better idea of where their risk and vulnerability lies as they're choosing who to have a business relationship with. And so we issued an executive order, and we laid that out a few months ago. And it was basically to indicate that we're going to look at our own investments through the eyes of an investor to see what we should be investing in, how we're doing our purchasing and procurement here in the federal government, so that we're looking to put our resources into companies that do disclose, that look at the risk profiles that they're managing in their investment portfolios and in their businesses. And then we'll working with the SEC and the FSOC and others as basically independent groups that we work with, but nevertheless feel like we could do a much better job at pushing them to routinize disclosure of climate risks.
Gina McCarthy working there with President Biden as National Climate Advisor, and that with Jennifer Gluya, Bloomberg Business Sustainable Summit today. We've got much more for you through the week. Chairman Powell's testimony tomorrow will be critical, particularly after the shock inflation report today. Inflation from another time and place. Stay with us. This is Bloomberg.